So what you see here is the following. You see the increase of global inequality, which basically goes throughout the entire 19th century and is driven by the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the West, which of course creates large gaps between the countries that have become, they're in the process then of becoming richer, they have experienced Industrial Revolution, and those like India and China basically, which have not. And it is useful to think of the global income distribution really as an approximation of the relationship between the West, India, and China, because these three large parts of the world really, because of the population size, determine more or less what happens to global inequality. Then you noticed actually there was a sort of a plateau around World War I and the Great Depression, where actually the rich countries are more affected, which of course would be precisely very similar development to what we are seeing now after the financial crisis and I think after the corona crisis. And then you have another increase of inequality and a very long plateau of the 20th century, or the latter part of the 20th century, with World War II, the US dominance, and finally, then the third period is the rise of Asia. So if I were to divide this kind of a picture of global inequality, I would actually say that we have moved from a situation, what I called it, from Karl Marx to Franz Fanon and back to Marx in the following way. We had throughout the 19th century the situation where, let me just show you, the blue line is the inequality between nation states or between the countries. So what you notice in the period between 1820 and sort of 1950s, you see the rise of the blue bar, which indicates divergence between countries. In other words, countries are becoming, in terms of GDP per capita, or later I'll use income per capita from household service, they are becoming less similar. They are diverging. At the same time, in the 19th century, you see the red portion of the bar also increasing, and that red portion of the bar is a summary of all intra or within countries' inequalities. So that's why we have the 19th century where actually we have the divergence and we have class struggle because you have the rising income inequality within countries. That's why I called it, that's the period that actually was very similar to, in the first part of the 19th century, to what Marx essentially had in mind. Rising inequality within countries and not much attention paid to the increasing divergence between the countries. Then over the latter part, second half of the 20th century, you have the age, what I call the age of the three worlds. In other words, you have very high level of inequality between the countries. As you see, the blue portion of the bar is very high. I mean, it's very high, but the red portion doesn't increase anymore. So in other words, divergence within, or actually inequality within nation states, are at the level which is more or less constant. And even if you look more carefully, that was the level which is actually for the rich countries lower than it was before. So that was, of course, the period of compression of income distribution within rich countries. The third period is really basically, I think, from the end of the 20th century and the first 2 decades of the 21st, and probably that period will continue over the entire 21st century. And this is the age of convergence. It's basically convergence of Asia and European and North American incomes, and what I call the internal cleavage, where you have rising inequalities within nation states, but we are still not talking about inequalities that are paralleling or they are the same as in the 19th century. Actually, they are definitely less now than they were in the past. This is the same slide. It's just simply the same graph, simply now showing things a little bit differently that you can actually even maybe see it better. You see the red, the red line shows the overall inequalities within countries. You see that period of compression between the end of the World War I and the 1950s to the 1960s. And then you see actually more recently the small uptick. This is of course a much larger uptick, which you look in individual countries, but globally it comes as a small uptick. of the red line. But the blue line is really the line which does most of the job of reduction of global inequality over the last 2 decades. And that's the line which shows inter-country population-weighted inequality. And you see from the turn of the century, you see a very significant decline, and that's driven, not surprisingly, by China, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, all the countries which were either poor or already middle income, but had growth rates which are substantially higher than the growth rates of the rich world. And I think this maintenance of the differential in the growth rates between the Asian countries or poorer countries with lots of population and the West is something which, as I was saying before, would actually drive this blue line further down over the 21st century and reduce global inequality. I have to say that one unknown there is the position of Africa. This is an important caveat because Africa has not really influenced global inequality that much until now. But with the rise of population there being much more significant than anywhere else in the world, and with absence of catch-up, it could happen in, let's suppose, sometime in the 21st century that actually the absence of convergence of African per capita incomes overturns these advances in reducing global inequality. And that would come paradoxically, partly also because China, as it becomes richer, it creates gaps between itself and the rest of countries that are actually not growing at the rate that China has. So in other words, China, which was a great contributor to the reduction of global inequality, is already now a neutral country in the sense that actually when China grows, it is good because it gets closer to the US, but it is bad because it gets further away from countries like Sudan, Congo, Nigeria, and so forth. So we now really have the country which now plays the role of China is really India. And in that sense, India's growth is absolutely crucial for the continued reduction in global inequality. And likewise, as I was saying, if Africa does not begin seriously to catch up, we would actually run in the situation that the advances in reduction of global inequality would be actually overturned. So I will not read all of this. You can actually see that the argument here is that this decomposition and this change has very clear political and historical counterpart. In other words, when we do decomposition of inequality, I think we don't look only for pure decomposition, how much percentage is between countries, how much within countries. We look at really what is the political meaning of that. And I think the political meaning of the most recent period is reduction of inequalities between the countries, which makes the world much more homogeneous in many ways, simply because we don't have rising income inequalities between nation states. But the level of these inequalities is still sufficiently strong that migration is a strong force which technically should further reduce differences in incomes. So in other words, we actually have two tools, if you will, or actually three tools for the reduction of global inequality. One, for inequality between the states. One is obviously higher growth rate of poorer countries. The second one is international aid, which is relatively small, as we know, and whose importance and influence is, I think, rather minimal. And the third one is migration. So I think actually it's important to see migration as an integral part of global inequality. When we have large gaps between nation states, migration is obviously a way in which you reduce these gaps and reduce inequality and reduce poverty. And the second important development is what I mentioned before, was rising cleavages within nation states. So if you want to be really now very brave and to project these developments in the next, let me see if I can go to the further slides, in the next decades, you could actually say that we might, rather than being in this situation, which was the classical situation of the 20th century, when you had very large gaps between nation states, and then I'm using here a quote from Senghor, the Senegalese president, who saw the structure of the world as being a global struggle between the have nations and the proletarian nations. So that was the structure of the second half of the 20th century. Now, what would be the equivalent structure in the 21st century? If you want to be brave, as I said, you should see it as a situation where we are, in some sense, going back to the structure of inequality which existed in the 19th century, which means lower differences between nation states and greater, to some extent, homogenization of the world, in the sense that, like when you take a random individual in China and random individual in the US, you might not expect to actually see much of a difference in their incomes, but within countries, you might actually have an increasing inequality. So that would be the structure of the world, which would be similar to the one that existed in the 19th century, where actually the main cleavage becomes the cleavage within nation states. Now, does this mean that that if we have decline in global inequality, does it mean that we might essentially disregard that rising cleavage within nation states? And I think the answer is not necessarily, because as you can read here, if we actually have individuals who predominantly care about the relative their relative income position within national income distribution, then the fact that the global income inequality is going down is not something which is of particular relevance or importance to them. And I have here a sort of a nice indication of that, or actually a way to represent that. That was in a paper that I did with John Romer, where you actually use a parameter which indicates the concern between the difference in concern between national income inequality and global income. If we start with this first point, which is -6, this is the decline in global income inequality between 1988 and 2011. So if we really were totally cosmopolitan and did not care at all what is our relative income position within nation states, we would actually experience, in principle, the decline of inequality of, as you can see here, 6 Gini points. Then we let that lambda, that parameter, vary, and we gradually increase the importance that national income distributions have for us as individuals, and reduce the importance that global income distribution has for us as individuals. And then you end up with the opposite end there at the very top with number +4, which means that in the extreme case where we care only about our individual positions within national income distribution, our perception of inequality is indeed the perception that I think most of us have. It is a perception of national income inequality increases. So this is, I think, essentially a way to illustrate that from the individual point of view, or from the point of view of perception, the fact that the global income inequality is going down may not be something that was politically necessarily salient. Which may be politically salient is rather the opposite, that national inequalities are going up. So broadly speaking, we really have in the last 30 years, we have these two processes, which to some people at first look paradoxical, that we have rising inequalities within nation states and declining global inequality. But of course, as I tried to explain, the result of the decline of global income inequality comes as a result of the convergence in income levels, which means the convergence of mean incomes between countries. So since I've actually taken quite a lot of time on this, I have really to go a little bit faster. So let me try to actually show some things that historically, when you look at global income inequality and inequalities between nation states, gives you a different picture, and I think a richer picture of changes than simply looking at the averages. Now, this is the picture with the averages. That I'm using PPPs from Madison's most recent numbers. And what you see here is the change in the relative income position of China, Indonesia, and India with respect to the British GDP per capita, or in the case of Indonesia, with respect to the Netherlands. What you notice here is what we have already mentioned, is that you have had a period of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century where the Asian countries have significantly declined in terms of their real income compared to the West. As you notice here, China starts and India, they start at 35 to 40% of the British GDP per capita. They actually end up at almost only 5% in the 1960s. And then you have this rebound, which is quite significant and which probably would bring China now to the level, with respect to the UK, to the level at which it was in the early 19th century. But what you also can do, you can actually go beyond the averages when you use decile data from sort of estimates of inequality within nation states. So this graph works better when I actually introduce one line at a time. But as I said before, I'm afraid to start sort of experimenting with that because you might lose then PowerPoint altogether. So let's start with the blue line, which shows you the relationship at different percentiles of income distribution between the US and the UK. So here UK is my numeraire, and what the blue line shows is the position of the bottom decile, second decile, third decile, and so forth, all the way to the top 10% in the US versus the UK. So the first blue line is for the year 1870. And what you notice, if you just look at the blue line, is the following. You see that the very poor people in the US have an income level, this is all in PPP numbers, income level which is about 40% higher than the income level in the UK. You notice that the middle class in the US is also better off because they're above 100. If you're 100 means that obviously you are at the same level than the equivalent percentile in the UK. So you notice that actually the US middle class is at something like 30% above the UK. But you also notice that the very top of the American income distribution is less rich than the very top of the British income distribution. And this is again something that comes also from the book by Lindert and Williamson. It's something that makes lots of intuitive sense. We know that the very top of the American income distribution was not nearly as rich as the sort of landed property or aristocracy or very, very sort of rich capitalists in the UK around the mid of the 19th century. And this was really the pattern and the shape which really, I think, fashioned even our perception of the American exceptionalism and American attraction to the immigrants from Europe, because as you noticed, actually, the middle class, almost entire distribution, all the way to the very top, is actually better off than the richest country in Europe. You see the same pattern, almost identical pattern, in 1910, which is the gray line, except that now, since the US has actually advanced compared to the UK, you see everybody being pushed up, and now even the rich people are better off than the rich people in the UK. But what you notice in the last line, which is 2013, is this remarkable change in the relative position. And I think this is something that we, with the coronavirus, do experience quite strikingly in the US, is what you notice now is that the very poorest decile, and this is something which is quite well known because now, of course, we have much better data than in the past. The very poorest decile in America is at a lower income level than the poorest decile in the UK. But as you go to each sort of following income decile, you actually have an improvement in relative position. So the highest improvement compared to the equivalent income decile is at the very top of the US income distribution. So I think this chart really illustrates to a large extent what happened to the relative fortunes of UK and the US, not only in terms of means, but what really has happened in terms of the distributions. And I think it is actually quite remarkable that we have had over this last 100 years, because if you compare 1910 and 2013, you see an entirely different relative distribution. So I've done the same thing for the UK and China now. And there you have, well, the years, the years are again 1879, 1950 and 2013, so a little bit different years. So 1870 is the blue line. Again, the poor, everybody in China is poorer than everybody at the equivalent position in the UK. As you see, the largest number in this case is 40. So the poorest people in China are the 40th percentile. And then you see actually basically everybody else at the 20, having an income is only 1/5 of the British income at the equivalent point. So it's actually, that's why the number is 20, 1/5. Then you actually see this remarkable decline of China, where in 1950, everybody is at the 1/10 of the British equivalent income. So that's why this number is 10. It's actually, you are at the 10% of the equivalent income in the UK. And then, of course, you see that in 2013, the situation changes again quite dramatically. China has become richer. The position of different Chinese percentiles have all gone up. And the shape of the Chinese income distribution, similarly to the UK, to the US, is now that you're actually relatively better off compared to the equivalent UK percentile, the higher you are in the income distribution in China. So you see at the very top of the Chinese income distribution, they are now at about 1/3, and actually probably now at probably 1/2 of the UK per capita incomes. And the very top of the Chinese income distribution is now at the global top 1%, whereas if you look at the very bottom in China, you are actually still at a relatively low level of only 1/5 of the British. So let me finish with all these things. I think I'm already taking too much time, because I thought actually I would like to show you when I'm discussing that also sort of a remarkable situation of China and other countries like now. So we are now talking about really the present. These are the data 2013-14. So what this slide shows, start with the United States. On the horizontal axis, you have percentiles of the US income distribution from the lowest, like second or third percentile, the bottom percentile even. And the last one at the 100 is the richest US income percentile. And on the vertical axis, you have the positions of these people, these US percentiles in the global income distribution. Now, not surprisingly, even very poor American percentiles, as you can see there, like second, third, fourth percentile, would be around the global median. So practically nobody in the US is below the global median. And as, of course, you go higher and higher in the income distribution in the US, they are also higher in the global income distribution. It's not often realized that, of course, between 11 and 12% of the richest Americans are part of the global top 1%. So the global top 1% is almost 50% Americans. So it's actually American presence in the global top 1% is very strong, not only because there's like 11 or 12% of the American percentiles, but because also the country is very large in terms of population. For example, Switzerland and Singapore have also something like around top 10% in the global top 1%, but obviously they're much smaller countries. Then you look at China, rural and urban, and that's actually what I wanted to illustrate, and that's what I actually went straight to this slide. It's essentially like two different countries. The green line with the China urban, you notice, for example, that the median person in China's urban population is at 65th percentile in the world. So it's actually above the global median. And then, of course, every additional percentile is getting richer and richer. And the top 1 percentile of Chinese urban distribution is part of the global top 1%. But the story is entirely different from the rural population. That is, at each percentile, equivalent percentile is much poorer than urban. So you have, sort of what you might actually call first order stochastic dominance of urban over rural. And you also notice that the rural at the very bottom is very poor. They are actually people who are part of the bottom decile in global income distribution. You can also look here at Brazil and urban China and compare the two. You notice actually China being dominant throughout practically entire income distribution up to about 85th percentile, where Brazil then becomes richer. But simply I want to indicate that China now, if you look at the overall income distribution, first is divided between rural and urban, and secondly that the urban more and more has the features which are actually, how should I say, more middle class and richer than countries like Brazil. Finally, I'll stop there. I would like to point out to India, where actually I'm using income data, which I think are better than consumption data because they do not underestimate India's real incomes the way that consumption data are claimed to be underestimating. So these are like only two surveys that we have with income data for India. Of course, not surprisingly, the very poor people in India are also globally very, very poor. Then you have, of course, an increase. And then you have at the very top, the top Indians who are part also of the top 4 or 5 global percentiles. It is true that, of course, this is a little bit biased picture against India because each percentile in India is very large. So is, of course, urban China, rural China. If I were to slice India into the fractals, which would be the same size as the US, then you would have the top fractile of India being also part of the global top 1%. So I think I would actually like now to sort of to bring this to a close by simply showing you the two slides which are really part of the unpublished work and which deal with the changes between 2018 and 13. As a background, many of you have seen before the so-called elephant chart, which looked at the changes between 1988 and 2008. And to remind you, the elephant chart actually was such that you had, of course, large increases in income around the middle of the income distribution. You had almost zero growth at around the 80th percentile, which is where most of the lower part of the income distributions of the rich countries are. And then you had a very significant increase in real incomes at the very top. So now we can ask the same question. What has happened after the financial crisis? Have the top 1% maintained that sort of unusual, very strong growth at the top? And the answer is no. This is the growth incidence curve, global growth incidence curve between 2008 and 2013/14. What you notice here is in the middle of the income distribution, we continue to have very strong growth. We are talking about 50% real growth over the period of about 5 to 6 years. So really, we're talking about close to 10% growth rates. But then we have a steady decline in growth over the next part of the distribution from the 60th, 70th percentile and so forth. And actually, the lowest growth for the very top 1%. So the top 1% was really affected by particularly the first part of the crisis, and I'll show you that in a minute with the US data. But before I show you that, I want to display another variant of this graph, which simply tries to adjust for what we believe is underestimation of the top decile in different countries. So I adjust by that by using the gap between income or consumption from national accounts and household surveys, and I allocate that using Pareto relationship to the bottom decile. similar to what I've done with Christoph Lackner before, but this is a little bit better because definitely I have now much better data. Actually, these are 131 countries with percentile data based on microdata from all of those countries. So what you will see here is that with that adjustment, the blue line is now the relevant line because that's the adjustment line. We have a very modest uptick for the very top. So in other words, the very top might not have been as affected by the crisis as the original graph shows, but we are still way sort of far from the elephant chart, which actually had this very top being as high as the middle of the income distribution. In other words, the financial crisis has had significant impact on the very top of the income distribution. And this is my last slide, which I think it could be useful also when we think about the effects of the corona on the US income distribution. So here, what you have in blue is what happened to the US income distribution between 2007 and 2010. You see that everybody is in the negative range. Everybody has lost real income. The largest losses in percentage terms were at the bottom of the income distribution and at the very top. You notice that at very top, really not only 1%, but the top 5% have lost very significant amounts of money due to the, obviously, decline in the stock market, decline of their wealth, and consequently decline of the income which they get from that wealth. Then the second period is the red line, where you basically see everybody being at a zero, and the very bottom of the income distribution now regaining some of the loss. That was mostly because of the extension of unemployment benefits, I believe. And you see the rebound of the top between 2010 and 2013. So what would I then expect for the corona's impact? Although it is obviously too early to speculate, but I'll still speculate, is that we might have fairly deep cuts in the real income level of probably bottom 50 or 60% of the population. We had then less deep cuts maybe for the rest, but I would also expect the very top of income distribution to be affected similarly to what was the case in 2007 and 2010. As for the global income distribution, if the gap in performance between China and the West remains, as we currently kind of think, China would grow this year by 2 to 3%, and the Western Europe or Europe in general and the US might grow by -4 to 5 or even more, then the gap between the two parts of the world would actually remain very large. We're talking about six points. And in that case, global income inequality, I think, will continue to decline. Actually, we might even have an acceleration of the decline in global income distribution. So the basic trends then of rising inequality in many countries and diminished inequality globally may not be affected by the crisis. In other words, they could be even accelerated to some. So I think I should stop here. I think I've already gone too far. So let me finish here, and thank you for. I hope you have been able to hear all that we're saying, but and see the slides. So let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Branko. That was indeed quite clear toward the end. We were able to see, hear, and absorb everything. Before I turn it over to the discussants, now would be a great time for those of you who are in the virtual audience to formulate questions and submit them via WebEx's Q&A function or the chat, or if you'd rather be seen and heard, you can raise your hand. Now, over to our first discussant, Marty Finnemore, who is University Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at George Washington University, and is an expert on global governance, international organizations, and social theory, among many other things. You can look online at the bio for more extensive information on our guest and the discussants. But let's proceed to the comments by Marty. Thank you for coming out of your sabbatical to be here today.
Thank you very much, James. Is the audio working?
It sounds great.
Okay. So I first wanted to start by thanking Professor Milanovic for this very provocative and interesting array of data and presentation of it. This is not my usual world. I'm a political scientist, not an economist. And I study institutions, which I want to ask you a little bit about because they are noticeably absent from this account. So I wanted to ask you about three broad buckets of questions and with a follow-on in all three cases of asking you to do something you might not want to do, but I'll give you the opportunity of projecting, doing that hard job, projecting what some of these curves might look like given this big exogenous shock we've just encountered with the COVID viruses. So the first question I wanted to ask you about was domestic structures around taxation. One of the standard remedies for big income inequality in my world would be you fix income inequality by taxation and redistribution. In some of your other work, you have sounded more dubious about the possibilities for this, and you're in good company. I mean, policymakers all over the world have championed dropping corporate taxes on the theory that in a world of mobile capital, the only smart move is to lower your national tax rates. Otherwise, high taxes mean firms will leave your shores, taking jobs with them. And I wanted to get your sense about whether there are institutional national policy fixes that you think might work. And I'm thinking here particularly of the Size and Zuckman work that came out last fall about the same time you were publishing some of this in Foreign Affairs and elsewhere. They would, I think, argue that you're being a little fatalistic here. We have a decent sense of where firms are parking this money. If we have the political backbone, we could, in fact, tax this money. Elizabeth Warren and other Democratic political candidates have been pushing these kinds of proposals. So I would love to hear your comments on whether you think there are institutional fixes for some of the inequalities that you've presented in these data. Is this a matter of we just lack the political backbone? And I guess my COVID follow-up for this would be, okay, so Elizabeth Warren lost, which tells you something. But economic collapse on the scale that we're currently experiencing shakes up politics in really interesting ways. We're going to be looking at massive unemployment, huge demands on public spending, high levels of public anger. So even if you think that the Size and Zuckman kind of argument is wrong, might they be more right or less wrong in the future? I mean, how do you see these two things lining up? More briefly, the second set of questions I have are about institutions, and again, the sort of the institutions of capitalism, which you've also written about in other work. More recently, you've been talking about there's now, it's all capitalism all the way down, but there are two flavors of capitalism. There's this liberal meritocratic capitalism of the West, and what you're calling political capitalism in China, this capitalism in the service of the state, all run by technocratic elites in both cases. And again, I'm curious about whether you think those institutional structures and engines of capitalism will move through this exogenous shock in similar ways or in quite different ways that might disrupt the curves that you've been showing for growth over the last 3-5 decades. I mean, what happens to a model of capitalism when it's hit by these kinds of shocks? Will the political capitalism on the Chinese model be more nimble, more resilient, and so the regime stability problems they face will get fixed because a powerful state, which doesn't have to pay attention to rule of law and other pesky stuff, can actually bounce back pretty quickly? Or will the liberal democratic meritocratic capitalism do better because this rule of law, that is its strength and its resilience, will give it resources to weather this storm. So how you think the different institutional models that are generating inequality will move through this exogenous shock is a second set of questions. And my last set of questions you've already touched on a little bit, and those are about migration. I mean, if the free movement of capital, free movement of labor is a core of globalization, labor is a different input to production that comes with all these pesky entailments. Labor has rights. Labor votes. Labor riots in the streets if it gets really unhappy and is treated badly. And different national economies have dealt differently with migration, both inflows and outflows. We have a colleague here, Adam Dean, who has done extensive research on just coercion and repression of labor rights and labor unions across different contexts. And I think he would argue that in almost every national context, you're getting massive labor repression to create the kind of globalization that you've been studying. So again, I'm curious about how you think the kinds of migration patterns that have fueled the globalization we've been chronicling in this talk and in our studies of globalization, how is that going to change when we feed it through this pandemic? The political pressures for closing borders, for anti-nativist, anti-immigrant platforms. Yes, they precede this, but they are going to be amplified, I would guess, by this shock. And how you think that will play out going forward, I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts. That's all I have.
Thank you so much, Marty. That was most illuminating, the questions you're asking. Branko, I'm quite interested in hearing his questions, but let me go to the second discussant first, and then I'll have Branko respond overall at the end of the time. Next up is Hilary Silver, who's the chairman of the Department of Sociology at the George Washington University, who's an expert on social inclusion and exclusion. I first met Hilary at a conference on chronic poverty about 15 years ago, where I think, Hilary, you presented a paper on the process of social exclusion, if I remember it correctly. You were at Brown at the time, and we're really glad that you've come to join us here at the George Washington University a few years ago. So take it away, Hilary. Let's turn on your mic, Hilary.
Turn on my mic. Can you hear me now? Hello?
Perfect.
Yes. Now you're off. There you go.
Now I'm on.
Yep.
We're all, okay, great. Well, I want to begin by saying that I'm really thrilled to be discussing Branko Milanovic's work because for 20 years or so, I've been teaching his work in my social inequality classes at Brown primarily. And I've always wanted to have the opportunity to ask a couple of questions. So now I get to do it. So I always try to get my classes to understand what global inequality actually means, which sort of goes to the point that indeed most people compare themselves relative to those in the same country. Very often, people who are the closest to you are the people that you most care about and are concerned about in terms of envy and comparison and the like. So to the extent that inequality matters, very often it's relative deprivation that's at work. So when we talk about global inequality, I have difficulty trying to get my students to think of a global income distribution. It's a little bit like starting with John Lennon's Imagine There Are No Countries, right? You have to sort of get rid of all those national boundaries and line people up by height and if you think about just the world population, I mean, something like a third or more of the population are just in 2 countries. So it's very difficult for people to really get their head around it, even with all the nice Lorenz curves and so on. So what I wanted to suggest is that when we think about inequality in sociology, we're often thinking about social relationships. And then the question is, what is really, or is there any relationship between those at the bottom of say, that China's peasantry and the low-income people in the United States? And you show this very nicely with your graphs, but the question of whether one can see oneself or take the rising middle classes, say, of China, and actually identify with people, to see themselves in this other, is part of, I think, the challenge of coming up with new redistributive mechanisms to deal with global inequalities. As you point out, in some of your other work, international aid is not particularly effective. And I'm wondering to what extent we really should be looking at global inequality at all, and rather focus on poverty reduction, which is what Amartya Sen and others who focus on international development really care about. So that when we talk about poverty reduction and absolute poverty, this is something that very often the publics of the West can actually identify with, precisely for the reasons that you've said, that their levels of living are higher than those of the poor in the developing world. So that was one question. And of course, the reason to do that are for all the Rawlsian purposes, which is that people are willing to accept inequality precisely if it improves the level of living, the well-being of the people at the bottom. And now what we're starting to see, even in international policy circles, are calls for things like universal basic income, universal child grants, sort of a universal inheritance or whatever that Piketty has recently proposed, as ideas of providing support at the very bottom, so that absolute living standards are improved. So I would also like to ask a few questions about international institutions that were just discussed. I mean, also there's this, at one point in your work, you said there's no political community at the global level. And I found that somewhat surprising, and I wish that you would comment a little more on that. Because what we're seeing is the development of all sorts of new supranational institutions. I mean, the European Union is, of course, a great example of an attempt to build economic institutions, at least a market, that will counter those economies of the great powers. We see at the moment, in the middle of the pandemic, how important the World Health Organization is. And in those respects, I think that there's the arguments about that Piketty makes about, say, transnational democracy and the like are valuable. And this is particularly important if you want to stress migration as a solution to global inequality, because obviously inequality of income is not the only thing that's going on as part of the rise of internal inequalities or domestic inequalities. Those inequalities are overlaid with group identities. And in order to have free movement across borders, you sort of do have to imagine countries. You can't imagine there's no countries there. They are at work, and there are plenty of political forces trying to heighten the distinctions between migrant groups um, and 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 different minority groups at the moment as scapegoats for rising inequality within countries. So in order to open up those borders, I would think that we'd have to pay perhaps more attention to the construction of communities, the development of reference groups, seeing oneself in others, and developing and strengthening international institutions. That's all I've got.
Okay, thank you so much, Hillary, for those comments from the point of view of someone who is steeped in the group, in sociology. And now I'm going to turn it over to Branko to attempt to answer all of those in about 4 minutes, 5 minutes. What do you say, Branko?
Okay, I'll try to do it in 5 minutes. First, actually, I wanted, if I forgot to mention that, I really wanted to thank Trevor and you, James, for inviting me. I think I might have forgotten to say that because we are so busy with trying to figure out how to communicate. So let me sort of correct that mission. So thank you for having me here. And of course, I would like to thank, if I may go in first name terms, Martha and Hillary for excellent questions and comments that I will try to sort of answer, because I cannot really answer all of them. Some of them are difficult. So let me go with taxes first. Very briefly, I am of course very much in agreement that obviously you have to, we should tax much more corporations that are able to play tax rules and fiscal evasion and all that. All the arguments, and of course, tax rich people, Zuckman and Size, these arguments, I'm very much in agreement with. However, where I depart is, which I think is the matter of vision of like what we plan to accomplish. I think that one vision is a vision of a welfare state where basically market incomes are fairly unequally distributed because people have very different endowments of labor and capital, and then you have larger distribution, and then you equalize the income. And that was really the typical way that welfare states have been operating. They've been born with that approach, and this, I think, is a continuation what Size and Zuckman suggest. An alternative way would be, in my opinion, preferable, which is focus on equalization of endowments. Now, this is not going to happen in 1 year, not even in 5, not even in 10, but when you design your tax policy, design it with the objective that the endowments of capital and labor become more similar, which means focus on different ways in which you can call it, property owning democracy can be born, which in principle does not require a huge distribution of current income. To give you an example, you compare Canada and Taiwan. They all have the Gini coefficient of disposable income, which is about the same. Canada reaches that through 40% redistribution of global income. Taiwan reaches that through 15%. What is the difference? The difference is the Taiwanese distribution of both capital and labor endowments is much more similar. So I think this is the difference in the sort of the vision. And when it comes to individual policies, obviously they may be very similar, but the overall objective, I think, is different. So that was about taxation. Also, Martha mentioned absence of institutional discussion in my work and obviously in today's presentation. And I agree with that. The reason why that's the case is that we are really talking here at taking a very sort of bird's eye view that is really very sort of general and abstract. We cannot, it's very hard when you talk about 2 centuries of development. Basically, it's 2 centuries of global economic history that you actually have here. And when you talk of these 2 centuries with all these changes, you obviously cannot focus very much on institutions because either we don't know them, or at least I don't know them in all cases, or it's easier to focus on them when you actually take a shorter time period, or at least fewer countries. So I don't know if there is something. Oh, that was actually also on China and US. I think that you mentioned that. and whether that would be, how should I say, whether the tendencies that I argued about in political capitalism and liberal capitalism would be simply amplified, and who is going to come on top. I think it's a very difficult question. we are basically in such an early stage. We actually see certain features in China's reaction to the COVID, which are both negative and positive. Some of them are positive because of ability of a centralized state, which commands lots of resources to react extremely fast and in a very often draconian way to actually stop the expansion of the virus as it did. On the other hand, we see the negative features of that system, which is hiding of information by lower levels of government. And I don't want simply to use that as an example now. We have had a history of what is called, some people have called regionally decentralized authoritarianism in China. In other words, large powers given to the provincial level, but provincial level does not have an incentive to convey the true information to the top, simply because the advancement of provincial politicians very often depends on how they are seen to be managing their economy. And actually, I found a very nice quote from a French historian of China, talking about the Song dynasty in the 13th century. Very similar type of arrangement, where actually, essentially, provincial level has to occupy themselves with the provincial problems. Don't bring any problem to me. If you have a riot, solve the riot at home. So, and then, of course, the provincial level does not convey the information which is negative. So I think it is interesting in the case of China that these positive and negative features are both present. I will not now discuss the US. I think it has been discussed a lot. So, I mean, the reaction, so that also has certain features of a sort of a more decentralized system where states, as we have seen now, have taken really the major responsibility of dealing with the pandemic. On the questions that Hillary did raise, like for example, on is it really, what does it mean to look at the global income inequality? I think I actually have only 1 minute left. I totally agree that of course people's perceptions are very often perceptions, or not often, maybe 90% of people look at their relative position with their income distribution. Moreover, they look even within individual groups. If you remember, for example, that Rawls, very interestingly, when he speaks about high inequality in a given country, he says even if it is very high, it really would not matter because there will be non-competing or non-observing groups. So in other words, people look at their own small group and they compare themselves with the peers. They may not even look at the other group in the same country. However, I think the global inequality has certain features, not only about immigration, in terms of migration, but certain geopolitical features which are very important. When you see the rise of China, when you see the creation of the middle class of China, when you see the fact that the Chinese top 1% is also now global top 1%, it has an entirely different political meaning than when China, as you have remember that graph, China versus the UK, everybody was at 1/10 of the UK income level. So I think there are these political and geopolitical issues that are brought up by global income distribution. And let me just say another thing. It's actually the question of what is the global middle class is an interesting one, because when we talk about individual countries, we say, well, the middle class is really the mainstay, the requirement for a stable democracy. So polarization and inequality are really bad, with which I agree. But if we end up with a world, and let me just put this as the last question, with a world where you will have polarized societies, individual societies that would be all polarized, as the US is polarized, as China is polarized, and we have a global middle class, what are the political implications of that? And that's why I said we don't have governance at the global level that can use that factor, because we don't have global government. So that was my sort of reason when Hillary mentioned that. why I think that actually, despite their institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, the World Health Organization, we don't have global governance in a political sense. So I will stop there. But as I said, I think I would like people to reflect on that world, which will be the world of large cleavages within nation states, and lack even of sympathy or even maybe relationship to other compatriots, but a global middle class. How that world would politically be organized.
Thank you so much, Branko. We have a question from Katerina Popovic, who asks, what about Africa? And a kind of parallel question from Prakash Lungani, who says, you talked about China being two countries, urban, rural. What about India? And given India's pivotal role over the next 20, 30, 40 years, what do you have to say about that? Is it similar to China, or is it something different?
Similar to China, actually. Oh, for some reason I can hear myself. Okay, similar to China. If I had the same, I do have the same graph with India, rural and urban, and you have, of course, the same split. And India is also, in some sense, two different countries. So, and to combine that with the previous question that was asked about Africa, I think, as I said before, India now plays the role that China used to play 20 years ago. In that sense, India's growth, first because it will soon become the largest country in the world, and it is the country which is still relatively poor, whereas China has now gone over the global median in terms of income. It really is crucial. Growth of India is absolutely crucial for the continuation of global convergence. But what will happen to Africa is something that I believe in the next 50 years would determine whether we actually continue with the reduction of global inequality or not. And there, let me just say one thing about the relationship between Africa and particularly Europe, because these two continents are close to each other, and they actually historically had, 2 millennia or 3 millennia of contacts that Europe didn't have with China and Asia as much. So we can really expect that unless Africa has really very significant growth rates, which because of population growth might actually require growth rate of about 7 or 8% per annum, not per capita, but overall by country, we actually either will have increased global inequality and associated migration of population because of large income gaps between Africa and Europe, or in a hopeful case that Africa becomes what China and India have become in the latter part of the 20th century, we might actually have the acceleration of global decline of global inequality and the formation of the global middle class.
So next, a couple of policy questions or prediction questions. Xavier Munoz has asked about COVID and nationalism. In particular, do you think that COVID plus nationalism may equal more equality? And Daniel Kasi, who says, look, you've written in your book that the universal basic income ultimately may come together through the left and the right. What do you think will happen in terms of universal basic income with respect to what's happening right now?
I think this is the question also that Hillary asked, and I did not actually have the time to respond. I think that my opinion, which is very skeptical in capitalism alone about UBI, I think has changed now in the light of the crisis. I actually believe that if a country had UBI, it would be working as an automatic stabilizer. In other words, you would still need a large program like CARES or something similar, but you would not need it in such a desperate way, and you would not need it to the extent that we are now having it, 2 trillion or actually almost 1 trillion in the European Union, because we would have had these automatic stabilizers in the form of UBI. Obviously, in those cases, you would not actually collect or claw back lots of UBI through taxation, because people would actually, incomes would go down. They would simply have UBI. UBI is not taxable, so you would actually have this automatic stabilizer. So going back to it, I think the question that Hillary asked me, I do think that the crisis might provoke or lead to a much more, how should I say, much more pro-social welfare, or let's call it welfare state reaction in many countries, particularly when we come to public goods like health, and I think education, like infrastructure and so forth. So in that sense, I'm optimistic in the sense that I believe that this crisis would be an opportunity for, let's call it the left, to take the initiative from the right. So that I think also answers the question about nationalism. Yes, nationalism will probably increase simply because the borders are closed now. They would remain closed. But I really think that this is a crisis where only the left has an answer. I don't think that the right has an answer, because the right would actually make this crisis even worse than it is.
So on that note, Sevin Grendi asks something about the elites. Do you think that despite all of that, that the elites might actually fight harder to maintain their position? And then Andrew Lay asks about automatic stabilizers. Do you think that they will have an impact? Do you think they'll become more prominent and have a greater impact overall in countries beyond the Nordic countries?
Well, I think they will become more prominent. I actually think that that was clearly the case, I think, in the United States, that we have seen that the absence of some of these redistributory function of the state, or the role of the state in terms of public goods like health, has been the reason that the US has not responded well to the crisis. People, of course, quote, which is actually quite interesting. I forget who did a study recently before the crisis, where the US was ranked like #1 in terms of ability to respond to the crisis. So clearly that expectation based on income, spending on, I suppose, on health, level of technological advancement, all of that was, as I said, based on some real numbers, but the reality has shown us that that was misconstrued, or at least what we thought were important variables did not react in the way that we were expecting. So I don't know what I was going to say now. I think actually, as I said before, maybe just to repeat, I actually think that when we look at the problems now, it seems to me only the solutions that are typically being proposed by the left are the solutions that make sense. Whether the elites would actually accept that really depends on how the political process works out, and not only in the US, but in the other countries. So if the political process, again, sort of leaves out probably 30–40% of the population who have very strong opinions which are different from the ruling sort of party opinion or the president, then of course, you will have a situation where the political process simply is unable to come to a solution or to a proposal that is sort of held strongly by a, I will not say plurality, but a significant minority of the population.
Great. And now we turn to a question by Yannick Omichkin. I mispronounced that. My apologies. Who asks a question about the role of cities and urbanization in global and national inequality. And Ariel Weinberger, a colleague here at GW, asks about China's policy that may have exacerbated some of the inequalities between urban and rural areas. The Hukou system, could you comment on that and what its impact has been and what might happen in the future in China?
There is nothing really special that I can say about that. Of course, the Hukou system has, as we know, has been created in order to prevent urban unemployment, which I think politically is destabilizing. So I think there was a political reason behind the system. We also know that that system is being disregarded because you have the so-called floating population, which, as James knows, is actually even a problem in our work with household service in China, because very often that population is not even included in household service because they are not officially living in, they are officially living in the rural areas, but they actually de facto are living in Shanghai, Beijing, Chongqing, and elsewhere. So I think that that has, of course, as we know, exacerbated inequalities because these people who live in the cities do not have access to a number of public goods which are only provided to the citizens, to the urban citizens. So it is a tool for the perpetuation of inequality. And that, of course, what we see in China is increasing inequality, not only increasing currently, I think it's actually decreasing now, but a huge gap between rural and urban incomes. What is also interesting in China, China is one of the few countries where you have still rural, well, not still, you have rural inequality higher than urban inequality. It is very unusual to have a situation like that. But China is, of course, in many respects, an unusual country, and that gap between rural and urban areas is probably higher than anywhere in the world. On the global cities, of course, it's a big topic. I will not have much to say. We are almost at the end. I think actually it is interesting how global cities have, to some extent, like London, let's say Barcelona, New York, have become, to some extent, dissociated from their own hinterland. The ironic part of this, well, maybe not the ironic, but the part of this COVID crisis is that these cities have been particularly hard struck by the crisis precisely because they're very much integrated in the rest of the world. So they actually have lots of transit, lots of tourists, lots of travel, lots of business people, and they have high density. So they have been, not surprisingly, if you look at Barcelona, if you look at London, New York, they have been really very strongly hit by the crisis. Now, whether that would mean in the future that there would be more green areas, whether people would actually move elsewhere and would not live in the big cities, I don't know. But I think it is noticeable that they have been affected by the crisis.
All right, then I'm going to actually use chairman's or moderator's role to say, I want to hear a little bit more, 5 minutes. Anyone who wants to drop off, you're available to leave. We usually start and stop on time. Today we were a little late. A couple of more questions, one by Hernando Grueso, who is a student at GW. Professor Milanovic, do you think AI revolution is going to do something for inequality? What's the impact? Also, Marshall Deng, do you think problems such as racism and nativism will have an impact on inequality, and how?
If I understood the first question, what would be the impact of the artificial intelligence revolution? Is this correct? Yeah. Okay. So well, it's very difficult question. I tend to not have how should I say extreme views that the AI revolution is going, or robotics are going to change our way of life and the economic background in such a manner that it would be unrecognizable. My argument is based on the fact that we have observed 200 years of technological development, and that many of the issues that are being raised now with respect to artificial intelligence are the same, technically the same issues that have been raised whenever there was a technological change, going back actually to Ricardo. There was this famous chapter on machinery in Ricardo, chapter 31, which really raises very similar issues. It's essentially what will happen with displaced labor. So can actually improved technology lead to lower wages? And actually, this is the same question that we have now. On top of that, I think that was actually driven by our sort of cognitive, epistemological, if you will, inability to forecast and to see the jobs that will be created by new technology. Let me put it in a very clear way. I mean, people like me who are already old can remember that 30 years ago, many of the jobs that currently exist have not existed at all. And if you were to ask somebody 30 years ago what jobs would be there, he would not know, simply because the jobs that we have in front of us are really the jobs that we know. If we really knew what would exist in 30 years, we would actually be really some kind of prophets, luminaries. We would actually be able to foretell the future. But we cannot do that, simply because we are limited by what we see. Actually, as Nassim Taleb says, and once he says, suppose you're in a Stone Age you're the advisor to your tribal chief. And then you say, well, the big technological development would be the invention of the wheel. But then he says, well, if you know that the wheel would be invented, then you already know that the wheel can potentially exist. So why don't you make the wheel? And that's exactly where we are now. And I think in that sense, what artificial intelligence will do, it will create a number of jobs that, similarly to the IT revolution, has created. So I don't think that we would live in a society where, you know, people would be jobless and they would have nothing to do, and actually all our needs would be fulfilled. And that leads me to the second point, why I don't think that the society will be dramatically different, because I think that the needs have no limit. In other words, again, when we look at our needs and say, well, I need today one computer or two computers, and then basically it will be all done and I would have enough. Well, there'll be other needs. Like, for example, we didn't have the need for the cell phone before it existed. But once the new products are being created, our needs are limitless, and consequently, with new jobs and limitless needs, we are going to have a society which is at high level of income, but not fundamentally different from what it is now.
Well, that, I think, brings it to a close for today. Thank you very much. I wanted to thank all the participants who have been in the virtual audience. Of course, Hillary and Marty, the IIEP team, including, of course, Kyle, the operations manager, and his crew, including Emma, Hamid. And of course, most of all, thank you, Branko Milanovic, for being here today.
Thank you. I still don't know if you can see me or not, but I'm waving now. If you don't see it, then at least you know that I'm waving. So thank you so much. It was really a pleasure. Sorry that we had these technical problems, but we solved them. Thank you.